Hi guys, Carissa Rose here. Okay, so today in this video, I'm going to be showing you how to draw this eye using waterproof pens and watercolors. In my demonstration, I'm using watercolors, but you can also draw the eye and then color it in with a different medium if you so choose. So to do this, you're going to need a sharp pencil with a good eraser. I used a mechanical pencil, and also a waterproof pen. I use Sharpie pens. Other examples would be Micron or Prismacolor. But if you're going to color it in with watercolors, you do need to use a waterproof pen. And also a fine-tipped paintbrush. And I used Prang brand watercolors for this piece. And make sure you are drawing this on a thicker mixed media or watercolor paper. I did this in my Strathmore mixed media sketchbook. So to start drawing the basic shape of an eye, you're going to sketch a circle very lightly. Don't press too hardly with your pencil. This circle will serve as a boundary for the corners of our eye. And since this eye is more stylized, I'm going to begin drawing the top eyelid with a nice curved shape. I like to make the inner corner of the eye a little bit lower than the outside. Then starting from the inside corner, adding a nice bottom eyelid shape. So what we have left in the middle is a space for the eye white and pupil. The next thing to do is to add a nice curved line to show where the top of the eyelid is. This gives your eye much better shape. Remember to keep those pencil lines light because you will be erasing them later. They may look dark on here, but that's just the contrast so you guys can see it better in the video. So now that you've got your basic eye shape laid out, you can start kind of cleaning up those lines. This is where I am smoothing out the shape of the upper eyelid. Not so worried at the moment about it being perfect because I'm going to be adding in eyelashes up there. Now I'm going back and erasing that original circle because we don't really need it anymore. Put in a little line at the bottom there to represent the puffiness of the lower eyelid. And another little line up top to kind of show where the brow bone would be. So now that your eye shape is pretty much all laid out, it just needs a little bit of fine tuning. So at this point, I'd darken up the lines I want to keep and then take out my eraser and start cleaning up the area a bit to make it easier to go over with my pens later for outlining. Also cleaning up that bottom eyelid to give it a nice clean curve. And take things at your own pace. If you need a while to get your eye shape right, pause this video and work on it a bit. If you're already past this point, you could always fast forward. But do keep in mind, I have over 20 years drawing experience, so if it's taking you a while, don't get discouraged. Take your time and work it out in your own pace. So what I'm doing here is adding a little line on the bottom of the eyelid, just a few millimeters away from where the eye white would be. The reason I'm doing this is because this is where you will be drawing the eyelashes from, on the bottom eyelid. You want to be careful not to draw them straight out of the white of the eye because that will look very unrealistic. The next thing I'm doing is lightly drawing in the shape of the iris. The iris of the eyeball is fully circular, but with the eyelid covering it up, it will be a partial circle, but you want to keep that shape as circular as possible. Now I'm adding a little curved line to represent the inner red part of the eye. And now I'm also going to lightly sketch in the pupil. You want to remember it's the center of the iris, not the center of the eye. A lot of times I see mistakes are being made when people try to draw the pupil equal distances from the top and bottom lid, but it should be directly centered in the center of the iris. The next thing I'm doing is lightly sketching in some eyelashes. I didn't want to put them too close together because you want to keep your eyelashes light. If you overdo it, it's going to end up looking muddied up and fake. I will be adding in more eyelashes when I go back with the ink, but for now, I like to leave just a few separated clusters to work with. You also want to remember that eyelashes are three-dimensional, so they won't be sticking just straight up out of the eyelid. There will be curve to them because they're coming at you. It's always a good idea to look at references if you're having trouble, but even better yet, just look in a mirror and check out your own eyelashes. So now as we're drawing in the bottom eyelashes, you can see where that line comes into play. You want to leave a space between the white of the eye and where the bottom eyelashes begin. When adding them in, it's better to keep them sparse at first. Remember, you can always add more eyelashes later. And unless they're wearing fake eyelashes, it's important to remember that the top eyelashes are always thicker and longer than the bottom. So now I'm going in with my waterproof Sharpie pen. You can use any type of waterproof pen for this if you plan on using watercolors to color your eye in, like I am for this video. Since this is a more stylized eye, I went with a very dark line where the eyelashes meet the eyelid. And now I'm going back in where the top of the eyelid is. Pen line work can be tricky, so a lot of times you have to smooth out lines that you've already drawn, which is what I do on most of my pieces. But that is something that you get better with practice over time. Line work takes a steady hand and patience, so make sure you take your time with it, because otherwise you can end up making a mistake and having to start over your entire drawing. So I'm going back over that eyelid line again, just to give it some more thickness and smooth it out. Since this is a more stylized, pretty female eye, and the eyelashes will be filling in that area once I fill them in, it just looks nicer. So now that I have that line drawn out, I'm going in and starting to fill in my eyelash clusters. When I draw eyelashes, I like to use a nice little flick of the wrist to make a line that is thick near the base of the eyelash and thinner near the tips. But this is also something that comes with practice, so don't be afraid to try on a piece of scrap paper first if you don't want to mess up your picture. Now that the clusters are filled in, I'm lightly going in and adding a few stray eyelashes in between without overdoing it, because I don't want it to be overwhelming. And always remembering to add that little curve in the front. You can see that the eyelashes overlap the eye white a little bit, and that's just because of the way eyelashes are. They come out at you. If you're doing a piece that has a lot of colors in it, it may be best to save the eyelashes for after you've put down your colors. As you can see, I also added a little line for that inside corner of the eye. The next thing I'm doing is turning the paper to draw this line of the bottom eyelid. The reason I turn the paper is because it's easier for me to make a curve by doing it on this angle, but draw however you feel comfortable. Even by putting it on the angle, I couldn't get it perfect with the first pass, so as you can see, I'm going back and smoothing it out. It's okay to have a little bit of thickness to this, but I didn't want it to be as thick as the top line, but it still turned out okay. So now before I ink this iris in, I decided I wanted to leave a place for a highlight. So I'm just lightly sketching in a little circle that partially covers the pupil, and this is the space that I will be leaving white once I fill in the eye. So now I'm going back in with my Sharpie pens and starting to fill in the outside of the iris. I normally like to do these lines a little bit thick and put in a nice little wavy texture because it makes it easier to blend in the colors later. It also makes it easier to fix any mistakes. If your circle is not circular enough, you can kind of thicken the lines a bit by having that black area there. It just makes it easier for some leeway. So now I'm going to go back in and get those bottom eyelashes filled in, remembering to leave distance between the white of the eye and the start of the eyelash. Remember to try not to cluster too many of them together and keep them nice and sparse and separated. Especially since you're working with black, it's really easy to overdo it. And also be careful not to smudge any of your wet ink. So at this point, I'm pretty happy with the shape of the eye and the eyelashes, so it's time to start getting that pupil finished. I left room for one highlight on the left and decided to do another little highlight in the middle of the pupil. And then I'm going in with my black Sharpie pen and filling in that pupil, trying to get it as circular as possible while also keeping the white highlights intact. After you've finished filling in the pupil, you're going to want to let your ink dry for a while before you erase it. If you have a blow dryer, you can blow dry it to speed up the process, but if you try to erase your pencil lines too quickly, you're going to end up with smudges all over your paper and a ruined drawing. I would suggest letting the wet ink sit for at least an hour before you attempt erasing, but if you have a blow dryer, you can be ready in as soon as 5 minutes. So once you've waited long enough for the ink to completely dry, you can go back in with your eraser and erase any pencil lines that you no longer need. I decided to erase pretty much everything except for the circle that is showing the highlight in my iris. I wanted to keep that a little bit of that line so I can watch out for it when I was painting. So for this demonstration, I'm using my Prang brand 16 color watercolor palette. The words on those watercolors are incorrect. That says green. I'm actually using the turquoise color. It's a blue-green. I'm starting by very lightly putting some blue in the white of the eye just to kind of show like a shade of shadows from the top eyelid, and then blending that with some water to make it nice and smooth. I will be going back over that white of the eye area with more colors, so for now I'm leaving it at that. And now I'm going into the iris. So I start on the iris by really putting a lot of pigment on the brush and beginning at the top where it would be the darkest from the shadows of the upper eyelid. After I've laid down a bit of that blue-green pigment, I go and I rinse my brush off in my water and then pat it down on my paper towel, so then I have a slightly moist brush and I can blend the shading in a bit. Also being very careful not to touch that other light blue area that I already did on the white of the eye. So the next thing I'm doing is going in with just a little bit of my yellow color. I typically use yellow when I'm doing the white of the eyes, mainly because if I were to use like a darker gray, I feel like it takes a lot of the life away. So I just dab a little bit of color onto there and then spread it out with some water. You don't want to overdo the yellow, just have a very nice sort of creamy yellow fade. And now you can see the correct colors written next to the watercolors. I'm about to go back in with that turquoise blue and very pigmented amount and start filling in the outer edges of the iris. I basically just blot a lot of the pigment around the outer edge of the iris, and then I rinse off my brush and pat it so it is only semi-moist, and then I go in and pull some of that color with the brush up the eye. I will be using a lot of layering to fill in this iris, so you want to start with light layers first. So I'm filling in this turquoise blue, making it a bit darker around the edges, a bit lighter more towards the center, and also darkening up the top of the iris where it is darker from the shadow of the upper eyelid. But at the same time being careful not to fill in any of that white highlight that we drew out earlier. If you screw up the white highlight and accidentally draw on it, you can always go back with a white jelly roller or white acrylic paint to pull it out later, but I feel like the result always looks a little bit nicer if you can try to keep that original highlight out in the first place. So as you can see, I'm continuing to layer on more pigment. A little time has passed, enough for it to dry slightly from the previous layer. So I continue to add the darker pigment around the edges and then blend it in using a semi-moist cleaned off brush. So then once I've gotten my solid base down for this iris, I decide to set that aside so I can let that dry a bit while I work on other parts of the eye. So I go and I rinse out my brush really good to make sure I get all of that turquoise pigment out, and then pat it pretty much dry with the paper towel, and then I dip it in the water again before I go up to my red pigment. So I get that palette nice and moist and pick up a little bit of red to start filling in the inner corner of that eye. So I put a little bit of that red pigment down and adjust it a bit with my brush once I've wiped it off. I'm not going too dark with the red at first because I just want a nice sort of reddish pink layer. You can see I also pulled that color a little bit towards the center of the eye very lightly to get a bit of a vein type texture going. but I am keeping it pretty light to start because I know I will be going back over that later once it is dried. I also add a little bit in the outside corner of the eye, being sure to clean off my brush and get a little bit of water and blend it so there's nothing too solid going on just yet. And now that the white of the eye has had a little bit time to dry, I'm going back in with a little bit more of that turquoise to just darken up the shading a little bit, continuing to blend it with my water. So I've gotten a good amount of turquoise there, so I decided to go in with a more of a blue-violet hue, just to kind of separate it from the turquoise in the iris. And I put that down a little bit dark at the top, and then I blend it out with some water. And you can see as I'm doing this that a lot more depth is starting to be formed in the shape of this eye white. A mistake a lot of artists make is not adding enough shading to the eye white. Just because they're called whites doesn't mean they appear white when you're drawing them. And since I added that purple on top, I decided to add more of that yellow hue. The yellow blending with the purple sort of becomes a bit gray. It kind of neutralizes it, so even though there's a bunch of color in the white of the eye, it's pretty faded looking. So since everything I've been working on with the white of the eye and the iris needs some time to dry before I can go back in with another layer, I decided to start filling in the skin. Since I'm using waterproof Sharpie pens, I'm able to paint over the eyelashes, but if you're not using waterproof pens, then you will smudge all of your line work. And also make sure you've given the pens enough time to dry before painting over them, because otherwise they will also smudge or bleed. So before going in with my brown pigment, I first got the entire eyelid wet with water. And then I took some dark brown pigment and put it across the bottom of the eyelid, and then rinsed off my brush, and then dried it off a bit, and then used that semi-moist brush to pull my pigment around and get the shading how I wanted it on the eyelid. I also started doing a bit of a brown wash over the top of the eyelid, and then once it was already wet with water, I went and added more brown pigment, continuing to pull and move the pigment across the paper. I'm a self-taught watercolor artist, so I don't really know all the technical terms for everything, so I apologize for that. Okay, so I'm going to speed this video up just a little bit to 2 times speed for the portion of this. So when filling in this bottom eyelid, I'm being careful to leave space in between the eyelash and the eyes so you can see the thickness of the bottom eyelid. This will leave you with a much more three-dimensional looking eye rather than a more cartoony way. And since this video is just a demonstration of the eye, I'm just sort of blending out the skin shading into the background. If you were drawing this for a full face, you'd be blending it to go with the rest of the face shape. And you may notice that as you go over your eyelashes, they start to fade a bit. You can always go back over your line work later, but if you continue to go over it with pigment, it will fade the blackness, which is why earlier I said if you plan on using a lot of color on your eyelids, it may be better to wait to draw in your eyelashes. So now that I've finished that skin up, I'm rinsing my brush really well and picking up more of that turquoise pigment. Since the iris is dry from earlier, I'm able to go back in and add more color. I'm doing the same sort of thing I was earlier, adding paint around the edges of the iris. But then this time I'm taking my brush and rinsing it and wiping it mostly dry and pushing it to a sort of flat edge and using that to pull paint up towards the center of the iris. After I pulled up a bunch of that paint, I'm wiping my brush mostly clean again and then using that to sort of blend everything so it's sort of softer, and then repeating the process. I'm not done with the iris yet, but I'm going to leave it to dry a bit and go back and add some more veins. I paint them on fairly lightly, and then I try to pick up most of them. I like that it leaves a sort of blurry looking vein, and it gives it a little bit more of a realistic feel, but if you overdo it, it looks really cartoony. So I try to get it like somewhere in between realistic and cartoony. And if you overdo it, it could come off really bloodshot too. So the next thing I'm doing is very lightly and carefully taking some of that red and bringing it across the bottom of the eye white against the eyelid. By adding that sort of red fade from the outline of the bottom eyelid, I feel like it gives it a more realistic feel. I'm also adding more red dark spots into the center of the eye while leaving some highlights in the middle, since that area is kind of wet and is sort of highlighted when you look at it. Then I'm going back with more of that dark turquoise to work on the iris, and this time I'm very lightly drawing lines from the outside edges and towards the center of the pupil. For this, you want your brush to be pretty pigmented but not very wet, because you want to be able to get very fine strokes without it all sort of blending together. It just takes a lot of very fine lines going over and over, and just being patient and taking your time and then waiting to let that dry and going back to it. So this is, I think, the third time going over the iris with turquoise so far, and we're still going in and darkening the top and the outside of it. So now we're going to let that dry some more, and we're going to go back in and add a little bit more turquoise shading to the eye whites to add even more depth. And this time I'm going to put a little along the bottom of it to kind of give the white of the eye more of a rounded shape. So I set that aside to dry for a few minutes, and then now I'm coming back in and, of course, adding more dark turquoise with a brush that's not super wet but very pigmented. At this point, you really want to just keep adding color in places where you feel like need more color, and then you can also pick up some of the color if you dry your brush off. You can pick some of that color back up, but it's just all about adding it where it needs it and just working through it and being patient and layering it on. Since I've been painting eyes for a really long time, I didn't need a reference to draw this because I'm just really used to it and it's like engraved in my brain. But if you're struggling, it's always helpful to use a reference to try to get things right. And then once you've got it pretty much memorized, then you could draw it from your head. But references are always helpful for beginners and even for the most experienced artists. So the next thing I'm doing is just very lightly going in and adding a few extra lines and dots here and there just to give the eye a little bit more texture and more feeling of depth, and being sure to blend things that need blending and add more sharper lines where things need to be sharper. So now that I'm pretty much happy with the blue and turquoise in my iris, I'm going to go in with some black and darken up the top of the iris and go over some of my other black lines just to really give this some contrast and make it pop. So I put some very pigmented black across the top that was not very wet. And then I went and dried off my brush really well, so it was just semi-moist, and then went and used that semi-dry brush to blend down the black into the turquoise to give it a nice faded shade blend. Make sure you're being very careful when you're putting down your black. I find it's easier to put down black first and then blend it with water rather than putting down water and then adding black, because the black can really spread fast and muddy up any areas that the water touches. So now I'm going back in and kind of filling in the pupil with the black. If you're not that great with the brush, you can always fill in the black again with your waterproof pens. So I start to go over a couple eyelashes with my brush, but decide that I don't want to end up making them too thick. So I decide to go back over with my Sharpie pens, which works great over areas that are totally dry. If you do go back over your outlines again, you do want to be pretty careful though, because you don't want to end up making like a double line or thickening a line that's not supposed to be thickened. So sometimes a faded line is better than a extra double thick line when it's not supposed to be there. So we're getting pretty close to the end here, but I decided that I want to take some regular blue to sort of blend the black into the turquoise a little bit better, to make it fade a little bit better in the shading. And then I decided to also go back in with some more really fine little blue streaks to just sort of add a little bit more contrast overall to the pupil and really just make it pop a little bit more. So continue to add lines until you are satisfied with your eyeball. Careful not to overdo it though, because that can undo all of the work that you just did. If you ended up accidentally filling in your highlights, you can always use a dab of white acrylic paint or also a white gel pen / jelly roller to give you that highlight again. And there you have it. That is my video on how to paint an eye. So thank you so much for checking out my video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to leave a like and let me know in the comments. Be sure to check out my channel for more art videos. Thanks again, guys. Have a good one.